So I hope that most of you were able to, well, no, not most of you, I hope all of you missed me so much that you had to listen to the podcast on Tuesday just because otherwise you'd suffer withdrawal symptoms. This is the third in a sequence of lectures about the late 19th and early 20th century. So just to backtrack to begin with, the last two lectures were about the economic and social challenges to liberalism that emerged in the decades after the 1870s, and the ways in which they began to call into question some of the assumptions that had framed the sort of liberal understanding of the world that had emerged in the early 19th century. This lecture looks at the political challenges to that liberal common sense, and it does so by looking at forms of political critique that developed both in Britain and across the empire. And then on Thursday, we're going to look at the horror that was the First World War, an event that is often thought to be the final nail in the coffin of liberal England, although I won't be suggesting that it was so. Now, the key element to these series of challenges that developed in the late 19th century, I think, was shaped by a new type of experience of the world, a new type of global condition that emerges in the late 19th century. The world becomes a much smaller place given the development of new technologies of transportation and communication, and that had, as we saw last week, very important consequences for the reshaping of the world economy in that period. It also had very serious consequences for the global competition for imperial territory. So it was critical to the formation of a new era of imperial expansion, seeking, of course, to capture new economic markets and new forms of geopolitical influence. In a way, the Titanic that you see behind me is a great example of that process. It was built to be the largest ship in the world. It was built with a sense of recognizing that Britain was competing with other countries to be able to produce these vast ships. It was meant to work as an example of the preeminence of British shipping, which of course had been so important to the expansion of the empire from the 18th century. And it was built with the very newest technologies to be able to let this vast ship travel at unprecedented speeds across the Atlantic to the US, which was becoming Britain's major economic rival at this time. And built also in the context of a massive period of the acceleration of the arms race in the decade before the First World War, which primarily took the shape of naval competition with Germany, the attempt to match the speed of the growth of the German navy. But I'm also going to suggest today that the Titanic is a good image to start with because, like the Titanic, liberalism begins to hit an iceberg. That liberalism itself seems to be proceeding well, seems to be part of this great confidence in liberal progress, and yet hits a major set of challenges. And the challenges that I'm going to suggest, clearly liberalism doesn't hit an iceberg, but it does hit important challenges that undermine its central assumptions, and there are basically three of them that I want to undermine. So that everything I'm going to be talking about today is trying to show that these central assumptions that had guided liberalism from the early 19th century began to be called into question. The first is free trade and cheap government. That's a sort of cheap because I'm getting to it. The second is a benevolent civilizing empire. The belief in the empire is necessarily civilizing and benevolent. And the third is the rule of law and the idea that of political representation for all those people that were good liberal persons. Now, you thought that was the introduction, but I thought just for fun I'd throw in another one. This is a lecture that has lots of different beginnings. Because it wasn't just the sinking of the Titanic that seemed to gesture towards the demise of liberalism or liberal ideas of liberal progress. The turn of the 20th century, Melody, if I didn't love you so much, I'd be very cross. At the turn of the 20th century, there are basically two funerals that marked the passage of an era. The funerals of William Gladstone and of Queen Victoria. Remember, William Gladstone had been the dominant political figure of the late 19th century, been Prime Minister 4 times, Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times, and had basically been in and out of the cabinet from the 1840s. A totally dominant figure. And Queen Victoria had, of course, been Queen since the 1830s. It seemed that the 19th century was really coming to a close, and not just with the turning of January the 1st, 1900. But I want to emphasize that it wasn't all doom and gloom. That I don't want you to assume that there wasn't a vast amount of optimism and belief that Britain was still the greatest country in the world and that liberal progress would unfold for generations. Imperial expansion continued apace. The military spending around the South African War had given the economy a major kickstart, and the economy had come out of the recession that it had been in the 1870s and 1880s. And in all sense, it seemed like Britain may have turned the corner of those difficult final decades of the 19th century. But there were also, alongside that, I think, fears, darker undercurrents, that progress was giving way to its opposite, to forms of degeneration and of decline. You know from the lecture on Tuesday that there was a good deal of anxiety about the scale of poverty and the potential for racial degeneration at home. You're going to find out today that there is increasing political instability. Indeed, some historians even talk about this early Edwardian period in Britain in the first decade and a half of the 20th century as being one where Britain was potentially facing civil war on multiple fronts. And you're going to see today that colonial nationalism becomes a major problem for the British Empire. All of these challenges basically meant that very frequently in this period from 1900 through to the First World War, there were what we would now call the states of emergency. States of emergency where the rule of law was thought to be legitimate for the rule of law to be suspended so that violent force could be used to put down the growing political unrest. Rather like, if you like, a contemporary analogy would be after 9/11 and the sort of growth of the security apparatus of the state. Now, the classic account of all of these events is George Dangerfield's Strange Death of Liberal England, published in 1936. Still a rollicking good read if any of you want to expand your education. What Dangerfield does is basically provide a story of the way in which the Liberal Party, the political party that was the Liberal Party, was displaced by the Labour Party. And the argument he has is that the Liberal Party was unable to cope with the problem of nationalism in Ireland, the women's movement, and the rise of the Labour movement. That it tried to reinvent itself, it tried to embrace a new liberal philosophy, often described as new liberalism, to try and check the criticisms of these political movements, but that it was unable to. And then the war comes along and finally provides the final nail in the coffin of the party's future electoral success. I'm less interested in this lecture in the health of the Liberal Party, which actually, ironically, as I've just come back from Britain, is having a bit of a rough time at the moment because it's one of its key figures. What is he? A former chief executive of the party has been scandalously shown to have been something of a lech, I think it's fair to say. Anyway, that aside, I'm less interested in the future of the Liberal Party than I am in the way in which these events, as I say, undermine the fundamental assumptions of the liberalism that had crossed both political parties throughout the 19th century. Okay, so let's move on to this first section and talk about the challenges that came to this idea of a benevolent, civilizing empire. You'll remember that for many advocates of free trade, empire was not just an anomaly, but morally wrong. That free trade, for people like Cobden and Bright, was meant to provide its own civilizing impulse. That you could civilize the rest of the world simply by dint of trading with them. You didn't need to formally colonize them. And that philosophy had an important place in the Liberal Party that emerged in the 1850s and the 1860s. Not a dominant place, but an important place in that party. Nonetheless, it was a position that effectively disappeared in the final decades of the 19th century in the era of the Great Depression. As I said last week, basically, the Great Depression was a key catalyst for the imperial expansion of European powers, played out most dramatically in the continent of Africa. And Britain began to acquire a good deal of territory in that area. Indeed, it acquired 2.5 million square miles between 1885 and 1896. Kenya became a formal colony in 1880, Egypt in 1882, Somaliland, you don't need to get this, but just to give you an idea, Somaliland in 1884, Nigeria in 1886, Rhodesia in 1889, the Sudan in 1899, and so on. So the idea that you could have imperial influence without formal colonization had begun to evaporate, or had evaporated. And indeed, the question of imperialism and the character of the British Empire moved centre stage to political debate in Britain itself. There is a hardening of party political differences around the question of the character of the British Empire. And it went something like this. The Liberal Party, especially the Liberal Party under Gladstone, sought to uphold the civilizing impulse of empire. It was primarily a moral mission, the empire, for Gladstone. When he was famously elected in the late 1860s, he made this profound statement that his mission was to pacify Ireland. And Ireland became an abiding concern for Gladstone. He sought to introduce a number of reforms, like disestablishing the Irish Church in 1869, bringing in a big land act in 1870, that tried to take away some of the heat out of the nationalist movement there. But he also wasn't afraid to use the coercive powers of the British colonial state. And indeed, in 1870, a few months after the Land Act, he introduces the Coercion Act as well. So it's a classic balance of reform and repression, like we saw after the revolt in India. Nonetheless, by 1886, Gladstone does something that was really inconceivable a decade earlier, which was to introduce a Home Rule Bill for Ireland that would give Ireland its own parliament and allow it to have continuing representation in the House of Commons in Westminster. That Home Rule Bill was hugely important because it effectively split the Liberal Party. It was actually only narrowly defeated by 30 votes, but more importantly, 93 members of the Liberal Party, led by a figure who's going to be rather important today, a man called Joseph Chamberlain, that you see represented here behind me in a monocle, led these rebels and broke away from the Liberal Party. And they broke away calling themselves Liberal Unionists, Liberals who wanted to defend the Union of Ireland with the United Kingdom. 78 of those rebels, of those Liberal Unionists, were re-elected at the following election, and many of them, like Chamberlain, made the journey across the House to become members of the Conservative Party in the following decades. Now, the Conservative Party had a rather different view of the empire. They were much less interested in its moralizing impulse, the idea of being able to provide liberty or freedom to colonial peoples, than in the idea of using empire as an electoral strategy and as something to shore up and to promote the interests of Britain itself. And so under Benjamin Disraeli in the 1870s, and then later Joseph Chamberlain, the Conservative Party presents the empire as a way of protecting British jobs and of moving away from a free trade ideology. It's Chamberlain who first does this. It's Chamberlain who is the first person who begins to talk about the absurdity of a free trade empire and suggests that instead Britain embraces protection protection in a way that will enhance intercolonial trade through a system of imperial tariffs, so that trade within the empire would be able to go on without customs raises in customs duties, and those outside of the British Empire would be subjected to those protectionist tariffs. This split basically sets the tone of the debate that would run for the first 3 decades of the 20th century. That debate between free trade and protection, split between the Liberal and the Conservative parties, both with their different views of the uses of empire, ran through to 1931, when Britain finally abandoned its free trade policy. The final part of this imperial jigsaw puzzle is the very important role of colonial nationalism. And I'm going to talk to you about this in a variety of ways. I'm going to talk about India, I'm going to talk about South Africa, and later I'm going to talk about Ireland as well. Okay? But let me start with these rather horrendous images from India. Both of these images come from famine scenes in Madras in 1877. The first is obviously of emaciated, starving bodies, and the other is the representation in the Illustrated London News of a famine relief camp. The British Empire had, of course, you'll remember from Queen Victoria's proclamation, promised that it would bring moral and material progress to its Indian subjects. Okay? Indeed, every year they published a report called the Moral and Material Progress Report that sought to illustrate what progress had been made under British rule. But colonial nationalists began to develop a biting critique of British rule by using famine as a sign of its evident failure. Something like 15 million Indians die from famine-related deaths between 1859 and 1899. 15 million people in the course of 40 years after the imposition of direct rule. And figures like Dabadai Nairoji, who's really the key figure here in the 1860s and 1870s, say that the famines are a consequence of Britain's drain of wealth from India. That what it is, that instead of augmenting the wealth of India, that Britain drained India of its wealth by paying unproductive colonial officials vast salaries, imposing unbearable tax burdens upon its people, and making Indians carry the cost of supporting the standing army, the Indian army, which was used widely across the Indian Ocean world for protecting Britain's imperial expansion, for instance in Egypt in 1882. Indeed, Nairoji, and then later on Romesh Dutt, a historian actually, shows that 80% of the population had an income of just 20 rupees a week, when basic subsistence required something almost double that, 34 rupees. So here you have Indian nationalist figures taking exactly the same techniques for understanding the scale of poverty in India as are being used by Booth and Rowntree in Britain itself. Now, Nairoji's book, published in 1901, was called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. And for Nairoji, the un-British part of that rule was the absence of prosperity, the fact that Britain hadn't delivered on its promises. Nairoji was a great believer in free trade. He was a great believer in liberalism. Indeed, he stood for election for the British Liberal Party in the 1890s. He didn't get elected, but he stood in the constituency of Finsbury, which was where Mrs. Thatcher ended up getting elected almost 100 years later, or less than 100 years later. Nairoji goes on to be the first leader of the Indian National Congress. An alternative point of view was expressed by Mahad Ranade, who, like Mitchell, after the Irish famine, made a call for specifically Indian political economy that moved away from free trade and recognised that India's economy needed the type of protection that it had been denied by the imposition of free trade by the British. And these criticisms of British rule in India began to get taken up widely in Britain. So Henry Hyman, a key figure in the Social Democratic Federation I'll be talking to you about, one of Britain's first, one of the first leading parties for the labour movement, wrote frequently in support of this criticism. He wrote a book called The Ruin of India by British Rule, for instance, published in 1907. The other place where the criticisms of the British Empire were very pointedly discussed was in relation to the South African War, the so-called Boer War, the war of Britain against the Afrikaans in southern Africa. Now, in one way, the South African War seems to be the culmination of 2 decades of imperial expansion in the continent of Africa. Indeed, it's a war that led to a frenzy of patriotic fervour in Britain, which is often used to explain the election of the Conservative Party in 1900 in a so-called khaki election, because everybody was so obsessed with the conduct of the war. And it was in that context that J.A. Hobson was inspired to write his famous study of imperialism that proved so influential for Lenin a decade later. I don't have time to get into Hobson's critique of the empire. I'm just here remarking that the South African War was a key catalyst for it.